Morning, everyone. Welcome to the IWH Speaker Series for September the 28th, 2021. My name is Peter Smith. I am a member of the scientific staff here at the Institute for Work and Health. And it's my pleasure to be introducing today's speakers, Ron Saunders and John O'Grady, who will be presenting on estimates of the nature and extent of claim suppression in British Columbia's workers' compensation system. Just a little bit of information about our speakers and about the session before we start. Ron Saunders is an adjunct scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. He was the former director of the KTE program, the Knowledge Transfer and Exchange program at the Institute for Work and Health, and a senior scientist. And John O'Grady is the founding partner of Prism Economics and Analysis, which specialises in the analysis of labour markets and related policy issues. John has also been, or also was, a long-serving member of the IWH Board of Directors. Just a little bit of information about today's session. Ron and John will do the presentation. If you would like to ask a question, if I could ask you to put it into the chat box. At the end of today's presentation, I will be reading all the questions out to Ron and John, who will answer them at that time. So thank you very much, and over to you. Ron and John, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Peter, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to kick off. Just before we get into the presentation, I thought I would mention that besides John and myself, there were two others that helped with this work. Siobhan Cardoso of the Institute was the project manager and helped with the research. And Emma Irvin helped us with the liaison with WorkSafe BC and also reviewed drafts of our report. So I'm going to speak briefly to the purpose of the work, some key terms that we used, and the methods that we used. John will then speak to the key findings of the research, and then I will talk a little bit about how those findings compare with other studies that have looked at these issues. And then we should have time for questions after that. So the purpose of the research was to investigate the nature and approximate extent of claim suppression in the workers' compensation system of British Columbia. And this is research that was in response to a request for proposals from WorkSafe BC. They were the sponsors of the work. There are some key terms that it's important to go over, to distinguish before we get into the methods and the findings. And that is to distinguish underclaiming, claim misrepresentation, and claim suppression. So underclaiming, sometimes called underreporting, that is when workers appear to be entitled to a benefit, but do not submit a claim, or having submitted a claim, choose not to proceed with it. And there are a number of reasons why workers may decide not to report, not to claim. And employer pressure is a part of that, and we'll see in a moment how big a part it seems to be. Claim misrepresentation, that's when claims that are submitted as medical benefits only, or sometimes called no lost time claims, notwithstanding that the injuries or diseases did involve lost working time. And then finally, claim suppression would be where there's employer pressure, not to report or to misrepresent. So it's important to keep in mind that, underclaiming is not the same as claim suppression. It will be a subset. In terms of the methods, just a brief overview first, and then I'm going to describe them in a little bit more detail. But basically, there's two types of data that we looked at. There was survey data. There was a survey of workers and a survey of employers about their perceptions of these issues. And there was analysis of claim files, submitted to WorkSafe BC. So the worker survey was a web-based survey of about 700 workers in British Columbia who had experienced a work-related injury within the past 3 years. And they were recruited by Ipsos from a panel of workers that they maintain in British Columbia. There were 3 waves of the worker survey. The initial wave was about 350 people that was randomly selected from the Ipsos panel. We found after that wave that people who had lower levels of educational attainment appeared to be underrepresented in that first wave, and so we, in a second wave, we oversampled from people with lower educational attainment and to try to get a more representative sample. But there was also a special sample of 3 language groups in their languages, the 3 largest non-English speaking language groups in British Columbia, namely Cantonese, Mandarin, and Punjabi. And so there were 99 respondents from those language groups who got the survey in their language. The employer survey was a phone survey also done by Ipsos of employer representatives, which could be a manager, an HR manager, or if it was a small firm, it would typically be the owner. There were 2 waves of the employer survey. One wave was to sample across all industries. And then there was a second wave where we deliberately, this was in consultation with WorkSafe BC, we deliberately oversampled the 2 industries that were chosen because of higher claims incidents to try to help with looking at correlations between indicators of underclaiming or claim suppression and other characteristics. So we oversampled in those 2 industries with the additional 50 respondents. We have to be careful in interpreting survey results. Of course, as many of you know, I think, they are based on respondents' perceptions and recollections. As I've just mentioned, there was some deliberate oversampling in both the worker and the employer survey. And there may have been some workers who were not actually covered by the BC Workers' Compensation Act, although coverage is very high in BC, much higher than in Ontario. And then another form of our work was based on an analysis of claim files, and there were 2 types of claim files that we looked at. One type of claim files were no lost time claims, and we were looking at those claims to see if there were any indicators in the file that would suggest that there really was lost working time. For example, were there medical reports that recommended time off work, among other indicators that we looked at. And we also looked at a sample of rejected, suspended, or abandoned lost time claim files. So lost time claims that did not proceed for one of those reasons. They were analyzed for evidence to see if there was anything in the file that would suggest this probably was a legitimate claim, and also to see whether there was any indicator of possible pressure from the employer in these files. Although that would be indirect, we'd have to infer, so we couldn't be sure, but we looked for risk indicators in those files. I should say that the claim file analysis, the data were extracted by staff of WorkSafe BC who used a template that we provided, and we trained them. But then they were the ones who actually extracted the data from the files. So we only saw anonymized data throughout the project. And we also have to be careful in interpreting the claim file data. As I've kind of just mentioned, we can't really draw definitive conclusions from the claim file data that there was misrepresentation or claim suppression. There may be various reasons why anomalies appear in the file that are sort of legitimate. I mean, a medical practitioner may have recommended time off work, not knowing that the employer had accommodated return to work quickly through modified work arrangements, for example. Or an incident that involved lost time could have been reported as no lost time because the worker decided it was just easier, maybe because they thought this is only going to go on for a few days and I'd rather just access the sick leave rather than go through the process of filing a claim. So there are various reasons why we might see these anomalies without there actually being claim suppression. So we have to be careful in interpreting the data. But as John's going to describe in a little bit, we were able to use a variety of sort of risk flags from the collection of these data, the 2 surveys and the claim file analysis, and pulling that together, we felt that we could come up with ranges of estimates for underclaiming, misrepresentation, and claim suppression. And what we found, those estimates, is what John is going to talk to now.
Okay, thank you. So let me first start with the précis of some of the key findings from the worker survey that Ron described. And I'm going to look first at the incidence of underclaiming. And we established a threshold for underclaiming of 2 or more days of lost working time, and that represented 57.8% of our total sample. So what we're looking at, therefore, is the proportion of people who reported that they lost 2 or more days of working time who did not file a claim with WorkSafe BC. And for cases that met that threshold, somewhat more than half, 53.7%, did not submit a claim to WorkSafe BC. And somewhat more than a quarter of those respondents indicated that they received wage continuation from their employer on an ad hoc basis, or through a sick leave plan. Obviously a major factor in their not making a claim. When we then ask who in particular was underclaiming or not reporting, we find that underclaiming is much more common among immigrants, workers with lower educational attainment, workers who don't belong to a union, workers employed by a small employer, and workers who are employed on a temporary basis. The main reason that was indicated for underclaiming was lack of knowledge about entitlements, that is to say, how to apply for benefits. That was 40% of those who did not claim. And almost as important, individuals who did not believe that it was worth their time to make a claim. And of course, many of those were individuals who had access to pay continuation through ad hoc benefits from their employer or through a sick leave plan. 14.3%, however, reported that they perceived pressure not to make a claim for benefits, and that includes people who reported that this pressure emanated from their colleagues at work, and that we will see is related to fear of losing a group benefit for remaining accident-free. Next slide. In terms of estimates of claim suppression, there were various ways we could look at questions in the survey to gauge the approximate order of magnitude of perceived claim suppression on the part of the worker respondents to those surveys. And the range of responses, depending on how you look at the questions, was 3.7% of the sample to as high as 13%. So what accounts for those differences? So if we apply the strictest criteria, 3.7% of the sample, which was 26 workers who had lost 2 days or more of work time, reported that they did not apply because they thought they would get into trouble or their employer pressured them not to apply. So that's the strictest test. That proportion increases from 26 to 31 respondents, or 4.4% of the total sample. If we add individuals who didn't make an application to WorkSafe BC because they feared they would lose a bonus, which also means they feared that their fellow workers would lose a bonus as well. And there were some workers who reported in the survey that they had experienced this kind of claim suppression behavior from their colleagues or their employers, but nevertheless submitted a claim. So essentially that's claim suppression activity that was not effective. So if we look at all of the cases, regardless of whether or not the worker filed a claim, where the respondent said that the employer asked them not to report lost time, or threatened with repercussions, then that takes us to the highest estimate of the possible incidence of claim suppression or attempted claim suppression, which was 13% of the sample. Next slide, please. It is interesting to note here, and this is, I think, probably truer of large organizations, that about a third of the respondents who reported claim suppression behavior also reported that their employer assisted them in filing a report to WorkSafe BC. The explanation for that apparent paradox is that it's often a frontline supervisor who discourages the worker from reporting an incident, but the company itself has an official policy of reporting all incidents, and human resources has a practice of assisting workers in making those submissions. So the paradox is the distinction between the behavior of the frontline supervisor and the company's policies and practices. It's also worth noting that a good number of the employers, a proportion of the employers, 40.7% of the employers whom the survey respondents described as engaging in claim suppression behavior also operated incentive schemes for being accident-free. And the contrast is that only 6.4% of the employers whom survey respondents did not describe as engaging in this behavior, in claim suppression behavior, operated those incentive schemes. The next slide, please. Then looking at the employer survey, we found that almost 3/4, 72% of the employers provided in the survey provided sick leave or disability plan or medical benefits plan, and about a fifth of those employers allow employees to access those benefits instead of making a claim to WorkSafe BC. In principle, they're not supposed to do that. They may or may not be aware of that fact, but they indicated in the survey they allow workers to access those benefits in place of WorkSafe BC. 10.7% of the employers surveyed reported that they provide a bonus or incentive to their employees to maintain an accident-free workplace. 6% reported their belief that in their industry, lost time injuries are rarely or never reported to WorkSafe BC. That's interesting that that's approximately within the range of suppression estimates from the worker survey. Somewhat more than a quarter, 26.7%, reported their belief that in their industry, lost time injuries are reported to WorkSafe BC as no lost time injuries all the time or almost all the time. And 25.3% expressed their belief that no lost time injuries were rarely or never reported to WorkSafe BC. So employers themselves believe that claim misrepresentation is a widespread phenomenon. Next slide, please. Now looking at the analysis of the no lost time claims or medical benefits only claims. And what we were looking for here was anomalies in the file record that were suggestive that the claim was misclassified, that is to say that the claim, looking at the file record, you would be suspicious as to why this claim was filed as a no lost time claim rather than as a lost time claim. There may be innocent explanations for some of those apparent anomalies in the file record, so that deliberate misrepresentation would be a subset of the total. And what we looked for were some risk flags. And we drew risk flags from the worker's submission. Sometimes the worker's submission actually said, I lost time. The reports of healthcare professionals that were in the file, and any evidence that the worker pursued or received lost earning benefits from another source, from another benefits plan. So next slide, please. Using the various risk flags, the lower boundary estimate for the risk of misclassification is 4.1% of the sampled files. And this is based on cases where the Form 6, which is the worker submission, indicated that there was lost time beyond the day of incident, or the Form 6 provided a date for the return to work that was more than 2 days after the incident. In other words, on its face, the file record suggested that there was lost time. The upper boundary estimate for the risk of misclassification was 12.1%. That was based on any of a number of risk flags that we identified, which we go into in more detail in the report. We also, just as a check, asked the employees of WorkSafe BC who were doing the actual file analysis for us, because as Ron mentioned, we developed a template indicating the data that we wanted them to extract from the files. They extracted that information and provided us with an anonymized database. But since they were experienced, we also asked their views on the files that they were looking at, and their experience, based on their experience, they thought that 5.2% of the files that they were looking at were probably misclassified. So that's within the same range that we came up with our more conservative risk flag. Next slide, please. We also looked at lost time claims, as Ron mentioned, that were rejected, suspended, or abandoned. And want to stress before we get into that analysis that there's no suggestion or in the analysis here that in rejecting, suspending, or abandoning the claim, WorkSafe BC acted improperly. In fact, their people basically went by the book, often went to some considerable lengths to contact a worker before suspending the claim or rejecting it. Suspended claims include cases that lack necessary information or the worker could not be contacted to provide that information. There are also claims that are voluntarily withdrawn by the worker, and there are rejected claims where the claim was sometimes not compensable. Next slide, please. So these are some of our findings. We would characterize a file as problematic when there are findings in the file record that simply make you question, why was this claim abandoned? On its face, there appears to have been an injury, there appears to have been lost time. Why didn't this go forward? There were 112 files where the Form 6 stated that the worker missed work beyond the date of the incident and sought medical attention. There were 71 files which had those two characteristics, and the file indicated that the incident was also witnessed by another worker. And then there were 93 files where both the Form 6, which is the worker submission, and the Form 7, the employer's report, concur that the worker lost working time beyond the day of the incident. So on their face, the file record, the record for those files suggests that there was a likely compensable claim. The WorkSafe BC team found that somewhat more than a fifth, 21.8% of these rejected, suspended, or abandoned claims likely pertain to what they considered to be a compensable lost time injury. So that was actually a higher estimate than we came to with our risk flags. Next slide, please. We looked at a subset of these problematic files to see if there was indications of employer pressure. And we found potential indicia of employer claim suppression activity depending on what test you applied, between 2.3% and 8.3% of the total sample. So there were 14 files with an employer objection, notwithstanding that there was a physician's recommendation that the worker take 7 or more days off work. This doesn't mean that the employer's objection was without merit, but on its face, it does seem to be puzzling that there is clearly lost time experienced by the worker, that there's a physician's recommendation for time off, and an employer objection. There were 50 files where the Form 6, the worker's submission, shows missed work beyond the day of the incident, and the worker sought medical attention, but there is no employer report filed. So the absence of an employer report for an incident, because the employer report is mandatory, is a problematic finding that suggests the employer was not cooperating. Next file, please. Or next, Ron, over to you for comparison with other studies.
Okay, thank you, John. Yes, so I'm going to now talk about how the findings that John's just presented compare with several other studies that have explored these issues. And so these are all Canadian studies. Two of them are studies that John was directly involved in, right? The first two, the study for the Manitoba Workers' Compensation Board, was by Prism Economics and Analysis, the firm that John co-founded, and that used a similar file analysis procedure and a similar worker survey design as to what we used in the study for WorkSafe BC. There was also a study by Prism for the Ontario Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, and it also used a somewhat similar file analysis procedure to what we used, but there was no worker survey in that study. There's the study that's now, I guess, almost 20 years old, Shannon and Lowe, but still cited quite a bit, which was a national survey in Canada that included a question about claiming workers' compensation benefits. So it has data on underclaiming or underreporting. And then there's a recent study done by colleagues at the Institute for Work and Health, Victoria Nadelin and Peter Smith, that surveyed workers in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. And it included a question about claiming workers' compensation benefits. So it yields data on underclaiming that we can compare to. So if we look at what do the comparisons yield? So first of all, if we focus on underclaiming or underreporting, you will recall that John presented our finding from the worker survey that we estimated that, or we found in our sample that 53.7% of workers with injuries, lost time injuries or illnesses, work-related, that involved, according to their report, 2 or more days of lost working time. 53.7% did not report. Now, we focused on 2 or more days rather than any lost working time, just to be sure that there was lost time in case there was the risk of a worker who came back the next day but reported that as a day of lost time. So we used a little bit stronger filter than in Shannon and Lowe, Nadelin and Smith, but we still came up with a very substantial figure, right? Over half of workers with work-related injuries saying they did not report. The Manitoba study that used the same, if we look at the same filter in that study, the number is a bit lower, but still substantial, right? It's just over 40%. The Shannon and Lowe figure was 40%. The more recent study by Nadelin and Smith was 64.5%, and that was again using all presumptively eligible claims. So that finding is actually quite similar to ours when we focus on 2 or more days of lost time. So overall, I mean, when you look at those figures overall, I think people would say they're in the same ballpark. Clearly there's somewhat of a range there, but they're in the same ballpark. And they're all really indicating that underclaiming or underreporting is a substantial issue, that the incidence of that is quite substantial. A couple of studies suggesting it's a bit under half, a couple of studies suggesting it's over half. So that's underclaiming. The next key issue was around claim misrepresentation, right? Where a claim is reported as no lost time, and yet there appears to be evidence that it was actually an injury or work-related illness that did involve lost time. And so in our study, as John just described, we had a range of estimates that range from about 4% to about 12% for claim misrepresentation. In the Manitoba study, the figures are actually higher, substantially higher. The estimate there was about 14% to 35%. And the Ontario study was similar. The finding for the Ontario study was similar to what we found in BC, a range of 5% to 10%. And then the final category, the key one ultimately that WorkSafe BC was particularly interested in, is the estimated incidence of claim suppression conduct. And for that, we can only compare to the Manitoba study because we don't have estimates of that from the Ontario study or from Shannon and Lowe or Nadel and Smith. So when we look at our study for BC, again, as John just went over a moment ago, we found a range of estimates, from 3.7% to 13%, which is a substantial range. But remember that that's largely because when we're looking at the 3.7%, we are looking at only in cases where there was pressure and there was no claim. Whereas the 13% figure includes cases where there was a claim, but the worker still experienced pressure, right? Even though they claimed. And as John noted, in some of those claims, the worker actually reported getting help from the employer in filing the claim. So the 13% is the kind of upper bound figure of and pressure experienced, even though a claim might have been made. So if you decide to focus more on was there pressure and did the pressure prevent a claim, then our estimate would be closer to the lower bound of that range. The Manitoba study also generated an estimated incidence of claim suppression, and that was 11.5%. So actually a bit closer to the upper end of our range. So that's how what we found compares to other studies. And I'm going to open it up for questions in just a moment, but I did want to mention that if you're interested in a bit more detail about our findings, there is an issue briefing on the IWH website that summarizes the findings of our study. So if you want a bit more detail, you could have a look at the issue briefing that's available on the IWH website. So I think we are ready to open things up for questions. And while we do that, I'm just going to put up our contact information so that if you have any questions after this and you want to run them by us, you've got our emails there. And I think then we're ready to open it up.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron and John, for the presentation. I do already have a couple of questions in the chat box, which I'll move to. For those who joined us a little bit late, if you do have questions for Ron and John on the presentation, please pop them in to the chat box and we will address them in order. And the issue briefing, a link to the issue briefing has just also been put into the box. So the first couple are just around clarification issues, Ron and John. One was about the no lost time claims that you looked at. Did they also include claims where there was offers of accommodation or modified duties? So was it any no lost time claim or only no lost time claims where there was no offers of modification?
I believe it's any, but John, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, my recollection, it was any no lost time claim.
Second one is around just if you could provide just a few more details on the involvement of WorkSafe BC staff in the claim extraction and then how that differs from the claim analysis, just to be clear that they weren't involved in any of the analytical parts of the project, just the extraction of some claims. That's correct?
Yes, that's correct. Oh, sorry, John, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. So the procedure we used was we developed looking at the files that would constitute the various forms rather that would constitute a claims file. We developed a template to extract information from those files. Reviewed that template for its feasibility with the WorkSafe BC staff. And then the WorkSafe BC staff did the random file sampling. And then they also went through the files to extract the information, and they entered it in our Access database using that template. We then did all the statistical analysis of the data that was extracted from the files. So we are responsible for the analysis of that data, not WorkSafe BC. The caveat that I would mention is the one that I referred to in the presentation, which is that as a kind of a reality check, our work, since these were experienced individuals at WorkSafe BC, we also just asked their view on whether they thought the no lost time claim was one that likely involved lost time, and whether they viewed the claim that had been abandoned or rejected or suspended as one that likely involved a compensable injury. And that was just to generate an alternative estimate from people who were experienced in working with the files. And as you saw, it was orders of magnitude comparable to our own analysis.
Okay, the chat box is really filling up with questions. So, a question about the sample of claims. Did your analysis include both mental health claims, chronic stress injuries, as well as physical injuries?
There was no filter on the type of injury. So sorry, go ahead, John. I didn't mean to cut. Yes. So to the extent that it's compensable, yes, it would have been included in the sample.
Okay. So, question about the 22% of claims with an F6 and an F7 were valid, although they were abandoned. Do you know if WorkSafe BC still adjudicates those types of claims, or if they, I guess, if they don't look at them, even though they have enough information to make an adjudication?
I don't know.
Did you collect information on union coverage status? And is there any comparisons between claim suppression activities in unionised versus non-unionised workforces?
Well, the WorkSafe BC files don't code for union membership, so that part of the analysis could not delve into that aspect. We did look into it in the worker survey, and you may recall from the presentation that underclaiming was found to be more common in with non-union workers than with union workers.
Yeah, just to add to that, it was interesting because we found, as John said, underclaiming was higher for non-union workers, but in terms of the percent reporting pressure from their employer, there was actually not much difference between union workers and non-union workers. In fact, it was slightly higher for union workers. So we did look at that in the worker survey.
Okay. Do you know of any federal or provincial whistleblower protection programs that would enable workers to identify if their employer has not or has tried to suppress them reporting a eligible work injury or disease to WorkSafe BC or another compensation agency?
I'm not aware of any.
No, neither am I.
Just to note, I guess, for people who are interested, workers can start the claim submission process. They don't have to go through their employer to do so.
That's correct. The employer submission is not a requirement for the claim to move forward.
Okay, there's a question here about, say thank you very much. It was a really interesting presentation. In Manitoba, the Workers' Compensation Board Compliance Office has vigorous public advertising, but doesn't talk about fines and penalties against employers who suppress claims. Is it the case in other provinces that the WorkSafe or the Workers' Compensation Boards don't report their performance in addressing claim suppression? So they don't report how many employers have been fined because they've been found to be suppressing. Do you know of provincial agencies who provide performance information on the amount of claim suppression regularly?
I mean, the short answer is no. The more complicated answer is that the administrative procedures are different across the jurisdictions. Ontario does have a prosecutions function in its the WSIB. Other jurisdictions rely more on administrative penalties, which makes the two really non-comparable. In principle, one might think that the threat of prosecution is actually a more powerful deterrent, but the work that we had done in Ontario, the difficulty in actually getting a conviction is so high that it may not be nearly as much of a deterrent as one would think, whereas an administrative penalty could be more of a deterrent.
Okay. There is a question about if the full report is available, and I am just about to put the link into the chat box so people can. It's also available on the WH website.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
This one's about primary care physicians and ER physicians in particular. This person is saying that they've heard that a lot of ER physicians frequently see patients who are injured at work but don't wish to claim due to pressure from the workplace. Some of the physicians explain that they're required to report to WorkSafe BC, and others are concerned that they don't have the patient's consent to report. Has anyone done a survey of physicians or people, healthcare providers in emergency settings to get the perspective on claim suppression through that lens that you know of?
Not that I know of. It sounds like an interesting project idea. I don't know, John, if you're aware of something along those lines.
I know there was a study done of comparing ER data to, I believe, WSIB data to see the degree of correspondence, but I'm not aware of a survey of physicians per se.
Yeah, I think the correspondence work is actually led by CAM. I think it's too for work and health.
That's
anyway,
right.
It was an interesting suggestion.
Another question just around the comparison. So the comparison that you provided with the previous studies was quite interesting, both in terms of the levels of non-reporting, but the relatively low levels of suppression as part of the non-reporting. Did the similarities between Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia, did they surprise you that there wasn't a province where it was higher than you would have, higher than the other provinces?
Well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind, John, you should jump in on this, is that there was only Manitoba where you had the worker survey, where you had the direct question about suppression that matched our worker survey, right? So we didn't have that in Ontario. And it's harder to infer from just claim files, right, in terms of suppression indicators. So we didn't really have a good match in the Ontario. It was a more limited study. And I think Shannon and Lowe and your own study with Victoria Peter, I don't think directly looked at pressure, right? It looked at non-reporting. So it was really only Manitoba where we could compare the data on pressure. the Manitoba number was a little bit towards the higher end of our range, but within our range. But John, maybe you want to add to that.
No, I concur in all those observations. If there were two potential correlates that one might investigate further, it would be the overlap between employers that engage in claim suppression and those that also have incentive or bonus plans. And the second, and I believe this came out of the Manitoba study, the overlap between employers that engage in claim suppression and employers that use third-party claims administrators.
Okay, the next question's about Manitoba. Some of the differences between Manitoba and WorkSafe BC. I was saying that in Manitoba, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just reading the question. In Manitoba, they use medical consultants to make determinations on claims. Does the same happen at WorkSafe BC?
I don't know.
Neither do I. Sorry. I'm afraid our expertise on the details of the systems is not as extensive as some of our audience.
Including, yes, in particular me as well. In terms of just some details on, in terms of the lost time claims, where you had looked at the 2 or more days, the question is just around, I guess that assumes anything more than 2 or more days. So even claims with very significant days of lost time would have been included in that sample.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Getting to the end of the chat. So we do have a little bit more time. If people want to ask questions, I feel like I'm almost through the end of the questions at the moment. If I have missed yours, please re-enter it into the chat and I'd be happy to ask it again. Ron and John, I was interested in just your thoughts, given what we've got now, a reasonably consistent body of evidence that shows that approximately half of eligible workers' compensation claims are not reported to work injuries are not reported to workers' compensation claims agencies, although a much smaller proportion are due to suppression. What are your thoughts on the continued use of workers' compensation claims as a metric of occupational health and safety performance? Do you think it's still a relatively good metric, or do you have thoughts on alternatives to workers' compensation claims?
I mean, we do flag in the report that it's a concern, right? That the fact that people are relying on claims data to guide prevention efforts, it does raise a concern when the underreporting is so substantial. John, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure. It depends what your research questions are. If you're asking about what is the relationship between lost time and particular kinds of injury, what is the relationship between return to work and particular kinds of injury, then the administrative data is an extremely helpful and rich data source. If you're asking more questions of what I would call a general population health dimension, what is the incidence of work-related injuries, then I think reliance on the administrative data can be treacherous, because there's the evidence, and I believe we also cite a number of other studies that have come to essentially similar conclusions in terms of the order of magnitude of the underclaiming phenomena. It is huge, and the biases, that is to say, who doesn't underclaim, are not well understood, and so therefore you actually don't know what's being left out if you rely on the administrative data for general estimates of the incidence of work-related injury. So when we see graphs that tell us the incidence of work-related injury is falling, and that's based on administrative data, I think one can rightly be skeptical of that.
So one of the things that we mentioned in our report when we talked about potential future research, or including research by workers' comp agencies, is doing worker surveys on a more frequent basis. That gives you a broader picture, right? So maybe that's one of the things that should be considered is doing, surveying workers on these issues on a regular basis, so that you get somewhat of a wider picture that might inform prevention efforts better than just relying on the claims data.
It's an interesting point, Ron. I know in Australia, Safe Work Australia used to fund anyway a survey every 4 years or 5 years on if you'd experienced an injury at work, and also ask questions about reporting it to workers' compensation. There are a couple more questions which I'd missed before. I'm sorry for that. One was around, was there any follow-up or contact back to the employers of the files where it was found that the employer tried to suppress the claim, either by the research team or by WorkSafe BC?
I don't know.
Not by the research team. I mean, I think is what we could say. It wasn't part of the research project. There wasn't. I think there weren't enough. The size of the sample would have made it difficult if you were doing a follow-up to get numbers that would have been big enough to analyze. Right. That was the kind of thing we talked about in relation to both surveys, I think. So the research team didn't do that. Did WorkSafe BC ultimately follow up? We don't know.
Just a couple more just around the nature of underreporting. Whether you were able to look at whether it differed by industry sector or whether it differed for certain types of injuries. So certain types of injuries were less likely to be reported, or if there were differences across industries.
We did do some cross-tabbing by industry, and I don't really recall the details of the results, but that is in the report. In general, the public sector is highly compliant in reporting. We did not, to my recollection, do any analysis as to the type of injury.
In terms of the sector stuff, I have a table in front of me that suggests that the percent reporting pressure was a bit higher in manufacturing and in the transportation sector, in forestry and logging, than it was in other industries. I should add one thing to my previous answer too, because it's important, is that in order to be able to follow up as a research team with workers or employers who were connected to files that were flagged, they would have had to give permission to the WorkSafe BC for researchers to contact them. And then we would have had to get a second round of permission from them to speak to them. So that would have made it difficult for us. Another reason why it would have been difficult for us to do that from a research perspective.
Okay, I've got one last question. It's more of a comment than a question, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on it. Just around the implications of this work for primary prevention. So there is a body of evidence that suggests that employers should focus on rewarding positive safety practices, such as the identification of hazards in the workplace, rather than rewarding the absence of incidents, because it was feared that the latter would lead to the suppression of reporting those incidents. And this work does tend to confirm that when there are incentive programs around the reporting of incidents, that it can lead to claim suppression. So I guess the study suggests that employer incentives should not be associated with lagging indicators if the prevention is the true objective within those programs. I guess, do you have any thoughts or comments on employer incentive programs and maybe how they should be operationalized, given the findings about injuries, about how suppression is related to the reporting of incidents within the workplace?
John, why don't you go first on that one?
Well, I suppose the elephant in the room is the relationship between claim suppression and experience rating, because it's experience rating systems that create a financial incentive to an employer, and often they have a threshold or step function, which means that it's the next injury or claim that actually triggers a change in your rate. With respect to prevention through incentives that encourage proactive interventions on the part of an employer to prevent injuries from taking place in the first instance. I suppose a study that potentially would be relevant here is in the construction industry, where you do have certification of employers. It's a voluntary certification, but it's third-party administered, the certificate of recognition. Now fairly widespread in Canada, more recently being adopted in Ontario. And one could certainly look at the before and after effects of the implementation of the certificate of recognition, because the core criteria essentially apply to the rigor and maintenance of a prevention program in the workplace.
Ron, did you have any final thoughts?
No, I think that, in our study, the data certainly, there's a strong correlation, let's put it that way, between the existence of, no injury reward program and the incidence of reported pressure. So I think, we did flag that as something that workers' compensation agencies ought to think about.
Right. Well, that's it. We don't have time for any more questions. There is one more comment in the chat, just to note that the USA CDC also has a behavioral risk factor surveillance system that also asks questions of workers about whether they've had a work-related injury and if they received workers' compensation for that regularly. So I guess we've got the USA's doing it, Australia's doing it. It might be time for Canada to hop on board as well. So thank you again, Ron and John, very much for the presentation. Thank you everyone for joining in today. Just a reminder, you can subscribe to the IWH Speaker Series and IWH Alerts. Our next Speaker Series is on, I should know this, October the 19th, I think, which is a Tuesday, where I'll be presenting some work on COVID protections and rates of workplace transmission in Ontario using some population level surveillance data. So thanks everyone for joining in, and thank you again, Ron and John, for the presentation. We'll see you all
for having us.
in the next Speaker Series. Okay, bye-bye everyone.